all influences, be it Latin or Greek, French or German, in that sense. So what do we mean by language as a system of difference, or if I put it as Derrida would put it, of deference? So when structuralists had looked at binary oppositions as stable terms in a formal structure, for example, a grammar would look at language within structures, for example, SVO, subject, verb, object, the boy kicks a ball. It's a very formal, stable structure, unless you choose to alter it. But Derrida would look at that entire sentence or collection of ideas as to be in an unstable disequilibrium. And the reason he mentions is because there's a presence or an absence of traces. So all readers might not read the same passage in the same way. All readers will be constructing meanings differently. In a sense, Derrida also sees the signifieds also in a relation of difference, and they turn into signifiers or floating signifiers. And he talks about signifiers as floating. Now these are concepts that in a way revolutionized our readings on language. Coming to his main concept called the deference, in his work of grammatology, he looks at two words. He gives you two verbs, to differ and to defer. When I say to defer, I'm talking about a sign that is defined by its binary opposition to another sign. In the sense, black is opposed to white. But when I say to defer, it means the signifier black is distinguished from the other one, white, but is not completely erased, but it's only deferred. It's only bracketed or put under erasure. It can subvert the fixed meaning of the sign. Derrida's argument had been with this privileging of speech over writing within Western philosophy. And in a way, what Derrida was trying to do was to check into and see whether there was any essential difference between speech and writing. Coming to the Transcendental Signified, these are concepts that I'm going to explain before I just go down to the main ways of reading Derrida. He said the Transcendental Signified is our sources of meaning, and they are the centers of existence, their foundations, the external points of reference, whose definition should not be changed. For example, religion. For example, God. God is a transcendental signified. You cannot change. The Bible, the holy books, are also transcendental signified. They cannot be changed in that sense. So if you look at the notion of the transcendental signified and the binaries, you'll find that there are hierarchies. Hierarchy is extremely important in deconstruction. How can I decide reality if I don't put it into a system of hierarchy? So I'm giving you two examples here. One is from culture and the other is from nature. One is masculine, the other is feminine. And this is the way philosophy and literature, till the advent of feminism, since the 1960s, has been looking at the entire notion of gender. So if we talk about man, then there's light, and if there's light, there's reason, and if there's reason, there is culture, and culture, then you have the public space. With a woman, you have darkness, and with darkness you have emotion, and with emotion you have nature, which is the private space. Now this leads us to understand the nature of hierarchy. In the sense, traditional binaries are hierarchical, they can be reversed or questioned. And this is something what Derrida was talking about in his critique of metaphysics when he was about to look at logocentrism and Phalaegocentrism. This is central to Derrida, the notion of logos, because logos, as Plato, right from Plato's time downwards in Western philosophy, has been the center, the source, the founding presence of knowledge and human beings. It is the center from which everything emanates. It's a center around which everything revolves. It's like the sun in the solar system. It cannot be questioned. Phalaegocentrism, on the other hand, is a hierarchy. It's a gendered hierarchy, a man-woman hierarchy. At the same time, it talks about gender in the physical spaces. For example, the sun and the moon, reason and emotion, subject and object, etc. Now, how do we question the hierarchical binaries? Now, the two terms are mutually determinant in the sense the West has to define itself by having or rejecting any other which is different. The weak term is not really weak. Or there's a mutual implication which says one term implies its opposite term. Let's see if I can explain this. It says two terms are mutually determinant in the sense for one to be defined, you need the other, or you reject the other. In the sense there is an element of recognition. The second could be, instead of looking at it in terms of strong and the weak, let's say the second term or the second term is not really weak. Or the third way of looking at it is one term implicitly mentions the opposite term. In this way, one can question hierarchical binaries. Now, if we are talking about deconstruction and practices, now we need to understand what's an open text. So when we are talking about texts, we mention certain things like closed texts and open texts. Now, a text that would deconstruct its own unity or the author could be an open text, something like Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, or Gabriel Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude, The Moor's Last Sigh, or look at the latest novel by Rushdie, The Enchantress of Florence. Now, these are open texts. You can deconstruct the unity of the text. Another way of doing it is you reverse the textual binaries and you expose the undecidability, or you expose that moment of rupture where you cannot decide as to whether the plot needs to be interpreted in a particular way, or you search for multiple meanings. Technically, you could start and study the process of signification of a sign or a text and find out what it tries to erase. For example, have a look at Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. What does that scarlet letter A try to deconstruct? Find out where the text differs from itself. Search for ambiguity and undecidability. Look for intertextual references and the undecidability of meaning. In the sense, when you're talking about a text, it would cut through the work. So you start searching for certain references from within the text, which in a way would move counter to what you're reading. Derrida also talks about two other concepts like arc writing and traces, and he mentions that arc writing refers to generalized notions of writing, and it's quite possible that writing might not completely convey what the author wants to bring out. So when you're looking at those gaps, those absences that are present in what the author is writing, that would be arc writing. Second thing he talks about is a trace. Now, a trace is a rupture within metaphysics. It's a pattern of incongruities. That's how Derrida talks about it. A trace would be that which would go against the grain. A trace would be that which would be a clear rupture within the narrative of a text. A trace would be that which would be present within the subtext. So the moment you read it, you understand what's happening. What we could term as recognition. And in that sense, it's extremely anti-foundationalist. It's very decentric. So like new critics, like F.R. Leavis and John Crowe Ransom, deconstructionists read closely. They search for contradictions, gaps in the text, and they don't reconstruct it in that sense. Or they start talking about deference, where there's a constant state of deferral, because language is in a constant state of deferral. Any word does not have a direct relation with reality. So if I say the word tree, the tree does not have a direct relation with the tree outside. I could call it a dog or a cat. So when there's no direct reflection or a direct connection to reality, then language becomes very slippery. So in that sense, the desired object of what we are looking for is always being in a state of deferral. And this is what Derrida mentions with his ideas of deference. In fact, in Limited Ink, in the afterword, Derrida talks about metaphysics. He talks about metaphysics as that enterprise of returning ideally to an origin. Now, these are his ideas with logos, where he talks about a priority. And he mentions that it has to be a strategic, ideal movement back to the origin. And this has been the foundation of Western philosophy, of what he's trying to look at. Along with Derrida, you have Michel Foucault, who talks about the notions of power. In one of his texts, you have titled The History of Sexuality. He understands power as a multiplicity of force relations which are eminent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization as a process which, through ceaseless struggle and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or even reverses them, as a support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system. So Foucault is talking about power as a chain. It's a chain of command. Power does not function. Power does function in terms of isolation, but in terms of domination, it has to work through a chain of command. And he says that power is organized through a net-like organization which has individuals within it. They circulate between the threads of that net. And he frequently uses language which says that power pervades the entire society. So when you're looking at society today, we would find that there's this constant ebb and the flow of power and power relations. So life is, in fact, a network of power relations. Foucault also talks about discourse, and discourse is a term he mentions that scholars have developed to analyze the systems of thoughts, ideas, images, and other symbolic practices that make up what we following anthropology generally call culture. So when we talk about culture, we're talking about discourse, systemized discourse. Now, what would be the effects of this discourse on society as we know it? Discourses create worlds, the world as we know it today, the cultural world, the discourse, the world of civilization, the discourse of civilizations, the discourse of dissent, the discourse of politics, the discourse of the judiciary. These are all discourses. And in a way, they generate knowledge and truth. Discourses are something about which people talk. Discourse has a power embedded within it. And something that's very, very central is discourses are multiple. Discourses are not the same everywhere. Discourses need not be the same in a single nation. In that sense, a nation is comprised by multiple discourses. If Michel Foucault, and remember, Derrida, Foucault, Jacques Lacon, they're all players of the 1960s. And the 60s was a major time within the last century, as you had this huge anxiety that had developed as, for example, you had the Vietnam War, you had the Beat generation, you had the hippie movement, you had beat literature being written at that time. At the same time, there were intellectual movements all over France and the US, Europe and the US. France, definitely, because most of the thinkers that we're talking about, whether it's Jacques Derrida or Jacques Lacan or Michel Foucault, or feminists like Lucy Irigaray or Julia Kristeva, they all came out of the French academies. So if we looked at deconstruction as a desystemizing philosophy, Jacques Lacan is a post-Freudian psychoanalyst who puts his emphasis, like Freud, on cultural forces by which it shapes humanity. But he is deeply influenced by structuralism and post-structuralism, and he follows Saussure's ideas of language and bases himself on the ideas of signification. The Lacanian model has a three-stage model, like what Freud had. It talks about the real lack, the imaginary order, the mirror stage, the symbolic order, and the role of desire. Now, the real lack refers to Plato's